Week 10 is officially upon us, and today I'll be bringing forth my top 30 wide receiver rankings in the tier list format I bring you guys every single week, talking through my wide receiver 1s, my wide receiver 2s, my wide receiver 3s, and my 5 favorite deep flex plays, on top of the guys on bye and the guys that may not suit up in this week's game. So if you guys enjoy, make sure you leave a like down below, comment your biggest start-sit decision. I'll try to get to as many as possible. And of course, if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. We are on the road to 40,000. I appreciate you guys for that continued support. But with that being said, let's get right into it. All right, like I mentioned in the intro, prior to going into my top 30, I'll be bringing forth the will they play tier. General rule of thumb for these guys is we like to see at least one full practice prior to Sunday's games. And if we don't see that, if we see them, practice in limited capacity, I may lean towards a slightly lower ranked counterpart. So the guys on the docket for this week are Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Nico Collins, and Josh Downs. So let's start off with the Cincinnati duo. In terms of Jamar Chase, he plans to play through this back injury. That flared up on him in that Monday Night Football game against the Buffalo Bills this past week. Assuming he plays, I think he's a clear-cut top 5 wide receiver in a sneaky high-scoring game environment this week against the Houston Texans. Houston, obviously, last week, big-time performance of C.J. Stroud in that passing offense. I think that could be a sneaky shootout this week. In terms of T. Higgins, he is expected out for this game, and he is considered week to week after pulling his hamstring in Wednesday's practice. It's really just been a brutal run of luck for T. Higgins this year. Consistently has been dealing with some injuries. Hopefully, he can get healthy soon. Nico Collins, wide receiver of the Houston Texans. He hasn't practiced all week with a calf injury and at this point looks unlikely to play. Seems like I said, he is going to be unlikely to play. Sport MD Analysis Deepak on Twitter also confirmed this in his own thoughts. So if you do have Nico Collins rostered, be prepared to be without him this week. Josh Downs, wide receiver of the Indianapolis Colts, is also dealing with a knee injury this week, which is an expected knee sprain, MCL sprain, I believe was going around on Twitter. It's not a good sign for his week 10 status, and you have to prepare to be without Josh Downs. He would typically be in, that top 35 range, but given the fact he's expected out, look for some of these 5 favorite D-flex plays to fill that spot. On bye this week, week 10 of fantasy football, we do have the Miami guys with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles, Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams, and Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. So if you have these guys, obviously they will not be entering your lineup because you do not want to get that goose egg in your starting roster. But now we go on to the locked-in wide receiver 1 starts, starting off with my wide receivers 1 to 6, which you guys can see on the screen. That consists of Stephon Diggs, CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Keenan Allen, Brandon Ayuk, and Adam Thielen. And to highlight some guys in particular, Stephon Diggs, wide receiver of the Buffalo Bills, goes on Monday Night Football to play the Denver Broncos at home. He is my wide receiver 1 overall on the slate. He's averaged 21.7 PPR points per game, and he has one game all year with less than 15 PPR points. He's the model of consistent dominance and is the clear-cut #1 weapon on a Bills offense implied for over 27 points this week. He gets peppered 10.8 targets per game. He is just such a clear alpha stud wide receiver 1. The Broncos represent a top 4 matchup on the matchup chart. And while Patrick Surtain is a very good player in his own right, he hasn't quite played up to last year's level so far this year in what's been a shambolic Denver defense. With Tyreek Hill on bye this week and the Bills needing to rack up wins, I don't feel safer projecting any other wide receiver at the 1 spot than Stephon Diggs going into this matchup. My wide receiver 2 on the slate, you guys see the jerseys behind me, but we do have CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver of the Dallas Cowboys, going to play the New York Giants at home this week. Like I mentioned, he is my wide receiver 2 overall. And following week 5's embarrassing loss to the San Francisco 49ers, we've heard that Mike McCarthy and Dak Prescott have vowed to keep CeeDee Lamb involved as the primary offensive playmaker in this game plan, and they've delivered on that promise. CeeDee Lamb in his own right has been an absolute monster in the last 3 games he's played. 37 targets, 30 receptions, 466 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns in that stretch. The Cowboys just realized that their formula to offensive success has to funnel through this passing offense and has to funnel through their top 2 players with Dak Prescott and with CeeDee Lamb. And the offense has flourished since then. They're now implied for 28 points at home, and they've won their last 11 home games and have averaged nearly 32 points per game at home since last year. The only blemish on that spot was that home game in week 1 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers where they scored 3 points. And since then, they've been averaging 34 points per game at home in that stretch. I'm firing him up, like I said, as the wide receiver 2 overall in the week. week. Let's just hope this defense doesn't score another couple touchdowns this week against the Giants like they did in week 1. Because if they don't, I do think we are in store for a massive CeeDee Lamb blow-up spot. And now finally, the other wide receiver I'll talk about in this range who came in as my wide receiver 6 was actually Adam Thielen of the Carolina Panthers. He played on Thursday Night Football on the road against the Chicago Bears, turned 10 targets into a 6 for 42 line, 10.2 PPR points. If you guys started Adam Thielen, obviously disappointing by his standards like he's shown this year. This was always the risk, man. You're dealing with a bad offense. You're dealing with, subpar quarterback play, bad offensive line play. At some point, the regression was going to hit. And with Adam Thielen, it did hit him this week. I still project him as a fine top 15 wide receiver moving forward, but I clearly have to dial back the expectation, knowing the volatile floor that this offense represents. But moving on to my wide receivers 7 to 12 this week, we have in order Garrett Wilson, Mike Evans, Deontay Johnson, Michael Pittman, Devontae Adams, and Chris Olave. And the 3 guys I'm going to outline start off with Deontay Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers going up to play the Green Bay Packers at home this week. He comes in as my wide receiver 9, and he returned from his hamstring injury back to that clear-cut alpha wide receiver 1 role for this Pittsburgh Steelers team. I initially thought, maybe with Pickens' growth at wide receiver, we'd continue to maybe see him, nip into Deontay's stranglehold on the target hierarchy for the Steelers offense, but that just simply hasn't been the case. In the last 2 games, after only playing 66% of the snaps in week 7, we've seen Deontay Johnson score 38.5 PPR points, and that's commanded 23 targets in those 2 games. He's getting elite wide receiver 1 usage. And while the offense isn't very good and the matchup against a run-funnel Green Bay defense hurts the passing game ceiling, his involvement props his floor extremely high, therefore making him a wide receiver 1 in my rankings this week. But moving off of him, we do have Michael Pittman Jr., wide receiver of the Indianapolis Colts, playing against the New England Patriots this week in that Germany 9:30 a.m. kickoff game. He is my wide receiver 10 overall. While it may be the case that this may end up being a drizzler, we typically see these international games hitting the under. At the same time, with Michael Pittman Jr., he has averaged 17 PPR points per game with Gardner Minshew at quarterback, and the Colts are implied for 22 points in this game. Josh Downs, like we mentioned at the top of the show, is banged up with that knee injury, and he is unlikely to play. And I expect the basis of this Colts offense to revolve around their 2 best players, Jonathan Taylor and Michael Pittman. He is not the sexiest play, but I do think that Michael Pittman will be an effective one this Sunday. Next, we got Devontae Adams, wide receiver of the Las Vegas Raiders, going to play the New York Jets at home, coming in as my wide receiver 11 on this week. And I think he is the biggest buy low in fantasy football. Obviously, there's a daunting task this upcoming game. Elite secondary is playing with the New York Jets, the second toughest matchup on the matchup chart. But I'm willing to give Devontae Adams the benefit of the doubt because he's an elite player in his own right, and he has been absolutely peppered in O'Connell's 2 starts. But the game environment, admittedly, is not ideal in this game. The process here is quite simple. You're trusting one of the best wide receivers of his era with good vibes in this Raiders offense, and he should be treated like the focal point of this Raiders offense moving forward. And I do think that sooner rather than later, we'll start to see the Adams we got earlier in the season, the guy that was scoring over 40 points, the guy that was legitimately a high-end wide receiver 1 in fantasy. But for the time being, especially considering the matchup, I am going to limit my expectations to a fringe top 12 guy. Again, he typically would be, a lot higher than this, but I want to see the signs of life before I proceed forward with him as a top 8 option. But you guys knew to start these guys like I mentioned at the top of the show, so now let's spend some more time on the wide receivers I have in my 13 to 30 range. Starting off with the high-end wide receiver 2s, wide receiver 13 this week, DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. And on the flip side of the matchup, we have Terry McLaurin coming in as my wide receiver 15 this week, going to travel at Seattle this week. Starting with Metcalf, we get a real bounce back spot for the Seattle offense after their embarrassment against the Baltimore Ravens this past week. Geno hasn't been the same quarterback this year, and Metcalf has struggled at times, but the Commanders are a top 3 matchup on the entire matchup chart, and the Seahawks are implied for 25 points this week. Metcalf hasn't quite had his blow-up spot this year, but every number 1 wide receiver seems to demolish this Commanders secondary. We've seen the likes of, A.J. Brown doing it 2 times, DJ Moore doing it, Stephon Diggs doing it, and Drake London doing it in recent weeks. Their secondary is an absolute shambles, and I expect Metcalf to take care of business this week. Terry McLaurin, he has commanded 40 targets in his last 3 games, and the offense has shifted their passing concentration more to these wide receivers. We saw at the beginning of the year, the tight ends, the running backs being continually involved, but we've seen that since they've been able to keep Sam Howell upright in these last couple weeks, the wide receivers have gotten a ton more usage. This is still an offense that has thrown the ball 40 plus times in 5 of their last 6 games. And although Washington has a low implied total, the passing volume and the target opportunity for Terry McLaurin should carry him to wide receiver 2 status. My wide receiver 14 of the week was actually DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears, going to play the Carolina Panthers, which we saw last night. 9 targets, 5 receptions for 58 yards, also had a rushing yard in this game. Only 10.9 PPR points. Again, another disappointing outing for this offense, but it was an absolute drizzler of a Thursday night game. Not really much offense getting played both ways, so I understand the limiting factor. When you're dealing with bad offenses, sometimes this type of floor will happen. Again, I expect DJ Moore to be a wide receiver 2 moving forward, but this was definitely a low spot on his fantasy production this season. My wide receivers 16 and 17 respectively are Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons going to play the Arizona Cardinals on the road, and Marquise Brown of the Arizona Cardinals going to play the Atlanta Falcons. And again, this is another cross matchup battle. London and Brown play each other this week in a game where both of these teams are implied for over 20 points. For Drake London, prior to his groin injury, he was really turning the page and now finally gets that quarterback upgrade with Taylor Heineke after posting 7 targets on less than 60% of the snaps in Week 8 prior to the injury he suffered to his groin. Since Week 5, he's commanded a 26% target share and has averaged 14.75 PPR points per game. He now gets a top 10 matchup against wide receivers with the Arizona Cardinals, and I think he is poised to continue building off the recent success he's seen. For Marquise Brown, he's posted over 8.5 targets per game on the year as the Cardinals clear-cut wide receiver 1, and now he finally gets his quarterback Kyler Murray back. The Falcons are a tricky defense against wide receivers, but I do think that Kyler's presence brings so much to this passing offense moving forward. Brown has a 29% seasonal target share, and if Kyler Murray starts looking like the way he did prior to his injury, I do think that Marquise Brown has top 15 level upside moving forward. Wide receiver 18 for me this week is Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns, going to play the Baltimore Ravens on the road this week. And Amari Cooper has experienced a relatively volatile 2023 campaign, but in the games where Deshaun Watson has been healthy, he has been a true difference maker in fantasy football. 15.28 PPR points per game would rank as the wide receiver 16 on the year, and that's included games where Deshaun Watson left early in. He's a clear-cut alpha of the offense, but the problem is that this week in particular, the Ravens simply do not give wide receivers any wiggle room. They're a top 3 defense against opposing wide receivers, and the Browns are only implied for 16 points this week, which in my opinion does limit Cooper's ceiling tremendously in this type of game environment. I think this is a potential disaster spot in a classic, slugfest AFC North matchup, but I do trust his target involvement to be at least a wide receiver 2 this week. But moving on to my low-end wide receiver 2s, we have a pairing of teammates that make up my wide receivers 19 and 20 respectively this week, with Calvin Ridley of the Jacksonville Jaguars and Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars going to play the San Francisco 49ers at home this week. The Jags duo comes in back-to-back, and I honestly don't know what to do with them. Like on one hand, the base he just leads Christian Kirk to being the wide receiver 1, on top of that consistent, week-to-week involvement we've seen from Kirk this year. But on the same token, Ridley has shown that when this Jags offense is truly humming and it's truly clicking, he's usually the ceiling raiser of this offense. When Calvin Ridley is playing well, that means the Jags offense for the most part has played well this year. Bye week down, I'm expecting the Jaguars offense to work out some of their post-bye hiccups. And the 49ers defense, while it is no joke, they are a pass funnel unit. They've been susceptible to allowing big plays outside of the numbers. And I favor Ridley in this scenario as the outside wide receiver, but I do need to see him string together some consistent performances before I raise him back to that top 15 level status. Wide receivers 21 and 22 respectively are DeAndre Hopkins of the Tennessee Titans and Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, going to play that game in Tampa Bay this week. For DeAndre Hopkins, he's commanded 17 targets in the last 2 games since Will Levis took over as a starter, and now faces a pass funnel Bucs defense that allowed CJ Stroud and crew to put up 400 yards and 5 touchdowns this past week. Levis already looks like a big-time quarterback upgrade for the offense, and the Sharps are hammering the over in this game. Hopkins has commanded a 27% seasonal target share, and I expect another game flirting with double-digit targets this week. On the flip side with Chris Godwin, last week was a big-time letdown, but he's poised to bounce back against this pass funnel Titans defense. The Titans are the most favorable matchup on the matchup chart against opposing wide receivers, and Chris Godwin is primed for a bounce back after that letdown last week. Evans is still the number 1 wide receiver in my opinion for this team, but Godwin is set up for a big-time performance, knowing full and well that the Bucs are not going to be able to run the ball against this Titans front. There go. If you have Chris Godwin, fire him up with top 25 level confidence. Wide receiver 23 for me this week is Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings, going to play the New Orleans Saints at home, and he's the biggest dilemma I have in my rankings this week. I trust the talent level of Addison and the upside that Dobbs showed in his limited showing this past week against the Atlanta Falcons. No practice time, no problem. He played extremely well under the circumstances in that game. But I also have to acknowledge that Josh Dobbs simply is not Kirk Cousins. The Saints are very good at limiting opposing wide receiver ones, mostly due to the fact that they have one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL. The game environment in this matchup is obviously brutal, going up against Marshawn Lattimore in a game where the Vikings are implied for under 20 points. But Addison has been absolutely dominant since that week 4 goose egg he had against the Panthers. Low on wide receiver 2 with upside in my opinion, but also a lower floor than the other wide receivers in this range if Dobbs were to turn into a pumpkin this week. Wide receiver 24 for me is Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers, going to play the Jaguars on the road. And after a terrific start to the year in those first 3 games, we saw him average 19.5 PPR points per game. Deebo returns after battling injuries basically since that performance. Post-bye week, he should theoretically be the healthiest he's been all year, and he practiced in full this past Thursday. The 49ers are implied for 24 points this week and finally have all of their offensive playmakers healthy again for this game. I don't expect them to ever get back to, the 2021 levels of dominance we've seen from Deebo Samuel in the past. However, I do think that Deebo Samuel can get back to, top 15, top 20 level status if he shows that the health is a non-factor moving forward. But shifting off the wide receiver 2s, we head on to my wide receiver 3s this week, starting off with my wide receiver 25, Jahan Dotson of the Washington Commanders, going to play the Seattle Seahawks. 8+ targets and 2 touchdowns in his last 3 games. And the offense is starting to prioritize these wide receivers, like I mentioned with Terry McLaurin. Jahan Dotson is starting to develop a rapport with Sam Howell, and on an offense that is throwing the ball at the volume that Washington has. The targets are up, and he's simply playing better ball. There go. I want to trust his second-year wide receiver to continue being the steady fantasy option he has been in recent weeks. Wide receiver 26 for me is Tank Dell of the Houston Texans, going to play the Cincinnati Bengals on the road this week. And he was the wide receiver 1 of week 9. He has a prime opportunity now to build momentum with Collins expected out for this game. He's quietly averaging 14.3 PPR points per game on the year and 17 PPR points per game when he's played over 60% of the snaps for this Texans offense. I can make the case for him being even higher moving forward. And if he continues to impress, I have no problem ranking him as a wide receiver 2 and potentially over Nico Collins in my rankings on a week-to-week basis. He just has to keep stringing together performances because so far in his rookie season, he has absolutely dazzled. Wide receivers 27 and 29 for me respectively both play each other yet again this week. Gabe Davis of the Buffalo Bills going to play the Denver Broncos on Monday Night Football, and Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos going on the road to Buffalo. And with Gabe Davis, he is the most curious case in fantasy football. He can win you a week like he did 2 weeks ago, and he can go out and just put up a goose egg the following week. I feel like just accepting his volatile nature at this point is the way to play it, and giving him a wide receiver 3 baseline is safe, especially in an ideal matchup on paper, like I mentioned with Stephon Diggs. Bills are implied for over 27 points. Denver can't stop the passing game, and Davis has 5 touchdowns already on the year. And shifting gears to Courtland Sutton, the Bills are the second easiest matchup against opposing wide receivers, and Courtland Sutton has quietly had 6 touchdowns on the year so far. Basically just mile-high Gabe Davis. He's only gotten 18 targets in the last 4 games, but 3 of them have resulted in scores, and it's a tricky game betting on touchdown variance on such a bad offense like Denver has. At this range of the rankings and knowing that he's the clear go-to threat when the Broncos get close to the goal line makes him a safer bet in my opinion. Fringe top 30 play, will never be a top 24 guy given the consistent target volume, but like Gabe Davis on any single matchup can win you a week. Receiver 28 for me is George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers, going to play the Green Bay Packers at home, and he's really fascinating. It seemed like he was taking major strides towards being a wide receiver 1. He had expanded his route tree. We saw dominant target totals on his routes prior to Deontay Johnson returning. Only for now, Deontay Johnson has completely alphaed him these last 2 weeks, and he has returned to that volatile deep threat nature. Again, I hope he bounces back. I think he's a more talented player than this range of the rankings would indicate, but a tough matchup against a run funnel Green Bay defense and a lack of consistent targets will keep him as a fringe top 30 option. Again, he's top 30 solely because I think he's a very good talent, but it's starting to look ugly if Deontay keeps alphaing him at the rate he has. Wide receiver 30 for me is Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks, going to play the Washington Commanders. Logged a full practice on Thursday and looks like by all reports he is ready to go with that hamstring injury. And now, like I mentioned with DK Metcalf, he is getting the absolute sieve of a pass defense like the Washington Commanders represent. He's been disappointing relative to expectation this year, but he's still got that, weekly win you a matchup type of ceiling. He just simply doesn't have that wide receiver 2 baseline. Again, volatile wide receiver 3, similar to Gabe Davis, similar to George Pickens, similar to the other wide receivers in this range, but I don't think he's quite the same player like he was 2021, 2020, where he was a legitimate wide receiver 2. But now we move on to my 5 favorite deeper flex league plays. Jerry Jeudy of the Denver Broncos and Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. Another cross matchup with Jerry Jeudy. He's been disappointing this year with nagging injuries throughout the season, but I do think this is a get-right spot against the Buffalo Bills. Very talented player in my opinion, but we just need to see it from him at this point, and I think we do so after getting the bye week to get healthy this past week. And on the flip side with Khalil Shakir, Buffalo has basically just transitioned into a traditional 11 personnel offense. No more Kincaid running the slot. With Dawson Knox being injured right now, we do see that Kincaid is operating that tight end spot, which opens up more opportunity for Khalil Shakir. And in the last 2 games, he has absolutely taken and ran with that opportunity. 10 targets, he's turned into 10 receptions for 149 yards in those 2 games, and he's an ascending young player in another primetime spot, tethered to the right arm of Josh Allen in an offense applied for as many points like the Bills are. I do think that it's a real possibility that if Khalil Shakir keeps continuing to impress, he could downright just take this wide receiver 2 spot away from Gabe Davis moving forward. Third option, I have Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks going to play the Washington Commanders. He's entered the week banged up, but he is ready to go by all reports. And I sound like a broken record talking about this Washington pass defense, but if there's one takeaway you can take away from this video, it's that they are very bad. With JSN, he's put up 3 straight games of double-digit points, and I expect him to continue that trend moving forward against this defense. Fourth option is Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers going on the road to play the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he's been a flat-out bust this year. Like, if you guys drafted him in the 4th round, between the injuries, between the inconsistent play from both himself and Jordan Love, he hasn't materialized into the play I thought he would be, but he's healthier than he's been all year. Mind you, he came into the season hurt with that hamstring injury, and I'm willing to play him with tempered expectations. He's an explosive player that can change the game on any single target. We just have to see him finally deliver from a fantasy perspective. The 5th wide receiver I'll talk about is going to be Tyler Boyd of the Cincinnati Bengals going to play the Houston Texans at home this week, and it's pretty simple. With T. Higgins out, you are firing Tyler Boyd up with top 40 level expectations. He is the only real wide receiver handcuff in fantasy football. He has a more consistent target role on a great offense when one of Higgins or Chase misses. We already know Higgins is going to be out, and if Chase were to miss this game, because again, he is questionable entering the week, Tyler Boyd would ascend to top 24 level expectations. But either way, if you guys enjoyed, make sure you leave a like down below. Again, comment your biggest start-sit decision, and of course, subscribe to the channel on the road to 40,000. I appreciate you guys for that support. Also, if you guys want access to all of these rankings and more, there are 1 of 2 ways you can get them right now. First way, if you guys go over to Underdog Fantasy and you guys use promo code FSC on your first deposit up to $100, you will get both 100% match back on that deposit and get full access to our rest of season and weekly rankings manifestos. And the other way is by going over to Flock Fantasy and using promo code FSC for 30% off either the Flocker or the Mother Flocker packages. And by doing so, you will get full access to our rankings and more. But with that being said, peace out. We'll talk to you soon. Good luck in your Week 10 matchups. Hopefully you guys can secure those playoff spots.